Dan and Amy, oh boy, these nonpartisan good health organizations like the American Cancer Society, the American Heart Association, they don't have political positions, right? Wrong. They are both lambasting the Trump administration and the FDA for delaying the menu labeling requirements that were part of a provision of Obamacare. That, remember, we talked about this, like the requiring the list of the number of calories in the foods they serve. So Domino's Pizza Place would have like 10,000 different combinations
Right.
of pizzas and toppings and so forth, and it would all have to be listed somewhere so people knew how much additional caloric intake
We don't want to know.
from a piece of pineapple on their pizza as
As
compared to a
opposed to-
pepperoni.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just so.
Have you been to, at Wrigley Field now, they have the caloric intake for each item, which
Fine.
must have taken forever to rearrange those charts.
It's if they want to do that, then that's fine by them. A private enterprise.
They'll get in the chicken fingers.
The American Heart Association. Today is the day Americans were sure they would have this information available to them at the wide array of retail food establishments. We're extremely disappointed in the FDA's decision to push back yet again the deadline for food establishments to provide essential nutrition information. It is unfathomable, really unfathomable, why we must wait even longer for this simple nutrition information. Probably because there's some interest in not pushing some of these enterprises out of business or into layoffs to comply with the regulatory strictures of the federal government. That may have something to do with it. Anyway, for more on the topic of destroying capitalism through the administrative state and protecting certain favored individuals from competition, we're pleased to be joined by Dick Carpenter. He is the Director for Strategic Research at the Institute for Justice and the author of the book Bottleneckers, Gaming the Government for Power and Private Profit. Dick Carpenter, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
My pleasure. How are you this morning?
Good. And so Institutes for Justice does a great work, public interest law firm representing those that are being torn asunder by the government. And in one area that's under discussed is licensing. And, of course, licensing has a good connotation. We're ensuring that the provider of a good or a service is legit and it's not going to hurt anybody with their good or their service. And so licensing is a good thing. But you detail some cases where licensing is just a way to insulate those that don't want competition from competition.
That's right. An occupational license is a government permission slip to work. It forces people who just want to open a business or get into work to go to the government and ask for permission. And many people, as you just said, believe that licenses exist because, well, they must do something to protect the public or increase quality of service. Otherwise, why would they exist? But in fact, in 25 years of working on the issue of occupational licensing, we have yet to find a single example of a license that is created or protected by any means other than those in the industry to be licensed. That is, people, organizations, associations go to the government and ask for a license because it puts a bottleneck in their industry. It keeps competitors out, and it gives them an economic advantage as a result.
So give us an example. You wrote once about the American Music Therapy Association.
That's right. So the American Music Therapy Association and their sister organization, the Certification Board for Music Therapists, are waging a nationwide campaign in order to create an occupational license in their industry. So this association is going state by state because licensing is primarily a state function. They're going state by state asking for a license of their industry. Now, to date, there is no evidence of a systematic threat to public health and safety such that a license is necessary. But nonetheless, they have been successful in having regulations, licenses adopted in more than a half dozen states already. In some of those states, the licensing requirements are extremely severe.
But part of it, the licensing, the desire from an industry to get licensing is to legitimize the industry or the practitioner so that the government can't prevent them from plying their trade, right?
Well, yes. You'll often hear the association or the members of the association go to the legislature and they'll say, well, not only do we need to protect public health and safety, but we need this license because it confers upon us a certain amount of status or recognition that only license can convey. We're an occupation. We want to be a profession like those other professions that have licenses. And so this idea that a license can convey status, or it's the only way to do so, of course, is completely flies in the face of all of these hundreds, if not thousands, of industries and occupations that have no license and are completely they're an absolute profession and viewed as such by the vast majority of people.
And you see this disproportionately affecting those on the lower end of the economic spectrum, those entrepreneurs that want to start a business but have these barriers to entry like the licensing requirements and fees. And I note just recently Indiana finally rolled back their licensure requirements on hair braiders, which are, again, mostly minorities trying to start their own business and were inhibited from doing so by the previous regulatory regime, the licensing regime in Indiana.
Well, what you're talking about are the costs of occupational licensing. Many people think about the benefits, but they don't actually consider the costs of licensing. And the costs are not just the fees that an individual will pay to get licensed, but the costs of licensing are much greater. So the cost to consumers in the form of higher prices, the cost, as you just mentioned, in fewer job opportunities, and the disproportionate cost to those who are low income, who are minority, mid-career switchers, women. These are groups that are disproportionately affected by licensing. Also, interstate mobility and migration is reduced because a license hangs a giant not welcome sign at your state border, because it makes it very difficult for people who are in a state that is unlicensed to go to another state that is licensed. It also stifles innovation. So these are just some of the costs associated with licensing that are quite burdensome, but people don't realize just how significant they are.
Well, since he's been the head of our state as Governor Ronner, done anything to eliminate them, like unnecessary occupational licenses?
Well, you mentioned music therapy just a moment ago. Mm-hmm. Governor Ronner actually signed a bill into law that created a study committee for music therapy. So what this did was it created a board, an advisory board that spent months examining whether we needed a license for music therapists. And on April 25th, just a matter of days ago, you'll not be surprised to learn that this board put forward a very long report and that it recommended a music therapy license is necessary. So unfortunately, Governor Ronner, at least in that industry, has gone the wrong direction and seemed to encourage action or momentum toward licensing for music therapists.
Now, you're going to hear skeptics of this say, well, I think about all the professions that are regulated in Illinois. And so you think of cosmetologists and nail techs and roofers and dentists. I mean, without licensure, you're going to have every dentist is going to be the little shop of horrors, and people are going to be killed, and people are going to be hurt, and people are going to be, the bad practitioners won't be separated from the good practitioners, and all those arguments that you've certainly contemplated before.
Certainly. So for too long, we lived in the binary world of licensing, where people think there's either full licensing or no licensing. But there, in fact, is a menu of regulatory options that can be used in place of licensing that can achieve some of the same benefits, but without necessarily imposing the significant cost. So, for instance, we don't necessarily need licensing to regulate. We can instead perhaps use certification. So, getting to your point, there may be a way to use a certification system whereby individuals have the ability to say, I'm a certified practitioner of roofing or dentistry or whatever it happens to be, and that sends a signal to the consumer that this person has completed the education and training and examination and all the various different requirements to achieve certification, so that the consumer can have some comfort that this person is certified to do this work. But it doesn't necessarily, these different types of regulations don't necessarily restrict entry into these various different occupations. So these different types of regulatory schemes could be as effective, could introduce some of the same protections or some of the same signaling devices without imposing a lot of the costs.
All right. Well, it seems like a compelling middle way. Dick Carpenter, Director for Strategic Research for the Institute for Justice, author of the new book, Bottleneckers, Gaming the Government for Power and Private Profit. Dick, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.